All right. Hi, Jack. How are you?
I'm good, Douglas. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. According to your bio, it says that you are a seasoned CIA professional who served more than 3 decades at the agency. Is that correct?
That's correct. Season has a lot of connotations there, Douglas.
Well, I suppose if you're relating it to food or to people, it might take on a different flavor. But one of the things I was curious about was I was always under the impression that people who had worked there aren't allowed to tell people that they worked there.
Well, if you're undercover, and I was undercover for 80% of my time at the agency, but there's a certain level, when you reach a certain level in the agency, you become a public figure. There's no way to have cover when you're the chief of worldwide operations or the deputy chief of worldwide operations. So you become, you become a public figure. But the other thing that I think allows me to talk about my career, and my book is approved. When I say approved, I have to run it by rules and regulations and law by the CIA for review. And it's not about my opinions, but I can't talk about sources and methods. So it gets a vigorous scrub, but I can give opinions about anything under the sun. But why I can talk about it, many of my colleagues can't, is because I ended up in the action part about half of my career. Most people spend 95% in pure espionage, meeting agents late at night and putting down dead drops and so on. But that was always part of my career. But I also was in Chile when Allende was overthrown. I was in the middle of the Iran-Contra affair in opposition to it, I might quickly point out. I ran the Afghan program to drive the Russians out in the mid-late 80s. And I ran the counter-narcotics part during a program during the Escobar epoch. And I also knew Rick Ames, the spy inside of CIA, and looked for Robert Hansen. All these events became public. And as a result of it, that and a number of other things that I touched were in the public domain. So I provide what I would call insights, observations, and things about those operations do not directly involve identifying a source. So I think in that regard, I'm lucky. Most CIA people do not want to have anything to do with the action part.
Were you there at the time that George H.W. was head of the CIA?
I was indeed. I was much further down the pecking order at that point. I had the good fortune of meeting him then, but also when he left and was vice president. I remember very well, for example, he came to Argentina, and I was the chief in Argentina in the mid 80s. And he was the vice president of the United States, and he asked to see the chief of station. He came back into my office, and we spent a half hour. I thought he was going to talk about Cuba. And I gave this wonderful briefing in my mind, and he was very patient and listened to it. He said, "Well, that's great, Jack, wonderful briefing." And I'm sure it was not anywhere on his agenda. He said, "Jack, I'm just here to let you know that I'm behind the CIA, and I want your people to know that they should keep up the good work." And I thought it was a very classy move. There's no benefit, no political gain. We weren't going to vote for him, not vote for him because of it. But he took time out of a hectic agenda to sit down with the troops. And remember, he was the former director of CIA, so I think he had a special place in his heart. And he was one of the very few that after they left the agency consistently stood up in its defense. And I give him high marks. I think history will give him high marks because of how he handled the end of the Cold War and the first Iraq War.
I think so too. I think people that I've spoke to who have met him, like yourself, have always spoke very highly of him, and that he was a genuine person. What you see is what you got. He was patient. He was sort of a thoughtful individual, and I don't think his motivations were selfish in his presidency, particularly.
I think that's a very true, Douglas. But then there was a reception that night, which also in line with his personality. So I lay back. I'm not in the middle of the action. I'm always around the edges watching everybody else. But my two daughters and wife were there, and I was minding my own business, so to speak. And an aide came up and said, "Well, the vice president would like to have his picture taken with you, really. But bring your two daughters. And to me, again, it's somebody that's, it's not, it's for me and my family and our dedication and public service at the CIA. And there was no gain, but he went out of his way to invite my children to join him in a picture, which is, I was touched by it.
So you're here promoting your book called Spymasters Prism. And the book largely deals with Russia, is that correct?
Right. It tracks Russia's aggressive activities against us. Now, I was in the Cold War, but I spent 10 years after. But I'm not talking just about those things that many of us are aware of during the Cold War. It's really a contemporary book about, and it's my deep concern about what the Russians are doing today, aggressively meddling inside the United States, which is different than the Cold War, which I don't think a lot of people realize the implications of it. So I'm trying to draw attention not just to Russia's activities, but how different it is, and how much potential threat there is from that. A lot of people want to talk about China, and I will today, if you permit me, to contrast the two, how I see those two different threats.
Okay, well, let's go Russia first, and then if we have time, we can touch on China. You said that it's different. What is different about what Russia is doing today versus what they were doing in the 1950s and 60s?
Well, during the Cold War, we had an understanding. You're not going to find it in writing. There's a newer version of it. You'll hear the word Moscow rules. And what it refers to in contemporary times is, well, how do you conduct yourself operationally in Moscow, right? So don't wear a Mets t-shirt or speak English in a clandestine meeting. Tips for wannabe spies, so to speak. But there's an older set and much more important set of Moscow rules. And they're the rules that, what was the behavior, what were the understanding between the United States and Russia about what we would and wouldn't do? Take counterfeiting. We never counterfeited rubles. They never counterfeited dollar, both capable of doing it at a very high level. And the reason is you would destroy the financial system of the world. We had an understanding, there are a few exceptions I will quickly point out on both sides, of roughing up intelligence officers on either side. So there was never assassinations, never serious injury done either way. We had an understanding. But one of the most important understandings is after the Stalin period, we really didn't interfere internally in Russia's political affairs. People may not believe that. And they really didn't meddle in ours. There's a one-off during the Reagan years in the 80s where they dabbled a little bit. But really, we stayed out of the internal. We fought like hell around the world in many, many places, but not internally in both countries. So that's why it's not just getting into our election in 2016 and getting into the DNC. But if you stand back, it's really more ominous than that. It is the fact that both countries, or all the countries in the world, collect information as robustly as you can. It's using it. They used intelligence inside the United States, and that's breaking the rules. And the problem is, how do you reset that rules? And then you saw they continue to be bold in their actions and their hacking in the United States. What was the real outcome of the 2016 election? If you look back at the beginning, I was saying, oh, they're dabbling. It can't be Putin. It's probably some mid-level officer who got off the reservation somehow. But the more I looked at it, the more I studied in the process of the book, they have a strategy. It's a Cold War strategy. Putin's a Cold War guy. I hope we talk about that. And what you're really looking at is, how do you keep the United States in a weakened state? It wasn't to create a revolution here, and I don't believe on January 6th the Russians are behind it or anything like that. But if you look at the intervention in the 2016 election, it wasn't about really Trump or Biden and Hillary and how it was going to turn out. But look at the ramifications of their involvement. And while they received sanctions for it, look how distressed our political system has come in the last several years. Fighting amongst each other, hearings. I mean, it has been a very disruptive thing. So if you stand back, we're overly focused about the relatively limited involvement, impact they had, even though they did many, many Facebooks, bots, and all of those things. The real impact is the longer lasting disturbance to the political system. So I think that's an issue that is not being given sufficient attention, and too many of the political figures want to talk about it in terms of political objectives rather than national security objective that the Russians really had.
Well, what is their point? To be very simple, what do they want?
Well, I think, Douglas, for just a minute, I think I want to talk about Putin. Well, let me put it this way. Putin, you're in an autocratic system, so we really need to understand the thinking of Putin. What is Putin's strategy? I would give him an A for tactics. I think he is a very good tactician. I think the things that he wants to do strategically, he's implementing. I think his strategy is wrong. And his strategy is he really sees us as a Cold War adversary, doesn't trust us. And he was so deeply scarred. He was in Dresden when the East Germany and the darker side of the KGB and the East German intelligence service, when the country fell apart. His KGB collapsed momentarily. They came back quick enough. And he decided he was going to regain Russia's place in the world, but he was going to regain it in the same tradition of the Cold War. And if you look at him, going into the Ukraine, Crimea, warm water ports, trying to work with Syria, meddling in Venezuela, all of these things are Cold War activities. And I really do believe we should reset. And I think President Trump tried, and I think Biden will probably try the same to get a good relationship. But, I was in Argentina and barely learned how to do the tango, but I know one fundamental thing. It takes two to tango, and Putin really isn't interested in dancing. His objective is to keep America weak politically, because in his mind, he's in a Cold War. That means he's stronger and Russia's stronger. So I think it's a bad strategy. I don't think it's over the long term good for Russia, and maybe not even for him. So I think that's the key objective here.
Is he afraid of us? Is he paranoid that we're going to try to take them?
Well, I think there's two issues. It's always, in the chapter I have Spymaster Presidents, that's him. But there's a subtitle of the chapter, and it says, there is no such thing as a former KGB officer, right? Vladimir Putin said that. And I would say there's probably no such thing as a former CIA officer. But what he's really talking about, not whether you're carrying your KGB badge or CIA badge, it's how do you think about the world. And I think he looks at it with the KGB mentality, which is always good to have a little dose, little is the operative word here, of paranoia. You should be worried as a spy that you're penetrated. You should be worried about is there another move beyond the move? Is there another mirror looking in at the same mirror you're looking at? So a little healthy paranoia, but I would say it's not so much fear. I think he looks at it as a really cold-minded intelligence professional, that somehow Russia is stronger, he's safer with a weaker America. I think he's wrong, substantively wrong, but I think his moves are really internal. He's, the old Tip O'Neill saying, all politics are local. He's very much focused on Russia and the nation state, and somehow he sees us in that context. And it's not about, again, Hillary or Trump, it's about America. It's about how we impede him from being, and for having destroyed everything he loved at a particular point in his life.
So perhaps he's thinking that if he keeps America in turmoil, division, chaos, then we'll leave him alone.
Well, I think that's part of it for sure. Chaos, I don't think he wants chaos, because, if you don't want the situation as a spy master so unpredictable that you get the wild card that you can't handle. So I think chaotic may not be the right word, and even unstable. I would say weak, where you're fighting among yourselves and you're divided and you don't have a national consensus. What are we going to do in the cyber warfare? We need a national consensus to answer that. But when we're fighting among ourselves, it's hard for people of good heart to come together and trying to address this difficult problem. So we will continue to be weaker than we can be until we develop our own. On our side, we had a Cold War consensus. I must tell you, when I ran the Afghan program, when the Russians were in Afghanistan, both Republicans and Democrats couldn't do enough to support that program. And that's the way we should be on national security interests. We shouldn't be divided on that. That has not been the tradition of the Congress on key national security issues for all of my time in the CIA. And it's only in modern times that even fundamental issues are now disputed on pure political grounds.
Jack, unfortunately, we are out of time for this show, but I do want to extend an invitation to you to come back at your convenience when we have a schedule available for you that we can talk about China, because I think China is probably more in front of the minds of people right now. So I'd love to have you come back and hear your take on China and what's going on.
I'd love to come back, and just to leave a tease for the future audience, I think when we think of China, we think of a major geopolitical, economic, military threat. I'm talking about where is the intelligence threat inside the United States, and number one there is Russia. So you can have both pieces at play, but I think it's really worth discussing at some more length, and I would love to return at a time of your convenience.
Okay, great. Last thing, do you have a website you want to give out for your book?
First of all, you can find the book on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those good places, and we do have a website, Jack Devine, Spymasters Prism.
Thanks so much for coming on. This was really interesting. I know we could have gone on longer, but unfortunately our time is up. But I look forward to having you back on the show.